The Arizona desert never showed mercy. By 9 in the morning, the Falcon Mesa tarmac was already radiating waves of heat that shimmered like glass, rising in endless sheets off concrete that could have fried an egg. The sun pressed down with that particular kind of weight only the high desert knew, dry, punishing, and relentless. On mornings like this, smart people stayed inside, where shadows and air conditioning gave at least the illusion of safety. But Elena Ramirez wasn't most people. She stepped through the chain-link gate with the unhurried stride of someone who had learned to conserve energy in hostile environments. She carried only a small duffel over one shoulder and a folded slip of paper tucked into her back pocket. No visible uniform, no insignia, no patches. Just boots that had walked through real deserts, cargo pants softened by years of wear, and a ponytail that revealed a tan line where aviator glasses usually sat. The gate guard hardly looked at her. He was the kind of man whose shift dragged by in monotony, eyes on his clipboard instead of the world around him. He waved her through with lazy disinterest. Elena gave a small nod, polite, nothing more, and kept walking. Inside the operations tent, the temperature barely changed. The air conditioning wheezed and rattled, trying but failing to keep the desert at bay. Two instructors lounged at a folding table that served as their desk. One wore aviators indoors, as if the spirit of 1986 still demanded tribute. The other cradled a protein shake like it was a lifeline to confidence. They were laughing at something on a tablet. The sound was sharp, careless, the kind of laughter people made when they thought no one of consequence was around. Probably a video of some poor cadet washing out spectacularly. Elena stopped in front of them, placing her papers flat on the desk. Elena Ramirez. I have clearance for Apache simulator time. Scheduled for 0930. Aviator guy tilted his head, not bothering to hide the disbelief in his smirk. Come again? Apache simulator. Her voice was calm, even. Booked. Signed. Protein shake guy leaned back in his chair and gave her a once-over. His eyes carried the same expression she'd seen 100 times in 100 places, half amusement, half dismissal, as though she'd wandered into a room where she didn't belong. You want to what? Fly the Apache sim? That's correct. The two men exchanged a glance. Aviator guy lifted her paperwork like he was examining a restaurant menu. He skimmed a line, then dropped it back onto the desk with theatrical boredom. Yeah, see, here's the problem, sweetheart. We're running crew evaluations today. Not really open for tourist rides. The authorization is signed by your base director, Elena said, voice as flat as the desert horizon. Protein shake guy snorted. Don't care if it's signed by the Pope. The Apache isn't a carnival ride. People who don't know what they're doing. These birds eat them alive. She didn't argue. Didn't protest. She simply folded the paperwork, slipped it back into her pocket, and stepped away. Her silence didn't hold frustration or anger. It was just silence, measured, contained, purposeful. The instructors smirked after her retreating figure. Some folks watch Top Gun once and think they're maverick, aviator guy muttered. The laughter that followed was the brittle kind, more self-congratulation than humor. Elena ignored them. She moved to a metal chair at the edge of the tent, positioned where she could see the hangar across the sun-bleached runway. There, in the distance, the Apache simulator shimmered like a mirage. She sat, set her duffel at her feet, and folded her hands in her lap. Then she waited. The men behind her chuckled again. You can wait all day, lady. Still gonna be no. She didn't answer. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the sounds of the base wash over her. The thump of distant rotors, the hiss of hydraulics, the metallic ping of cooling steel. They weren't just background noise. For her, they were the echoes of a life lived in those rhythms, half forgotten and half impossible to forget. The soundtrack of missions she had flown, some remembered with pride, others remembered only in the sweat-soaked hours before dawn. A mechanic passed by, toolbag slung over one shoulder. She slowed when she saw Elena sitting so still in the heat. Most people fidgeted, checked their phones, moved restlessly when forced to wait. Not this woman. She sat like a rock carved from patience, unbothered by the furnace around her. "You okay, ma'am?" the mechanic asked. Elena opened her eyes. "Just waiting." The young woman nodded, though she cast a glance back before disappearing into the hangar. Something about the stillness nagged at her. She'd seen old Marines sit like that, able to outwait the sun itself if that was what the moment required. Back inside the tent, the instructors went on with their chatter. Their voices drifted toward weekend plans, coffee complaints, and occasional sneers about the stranger in the corner. They didn't notice the man who entered the briefing room later that morning. Air Marshal Robert Keane carried 30 years in uniform in the way he walked, in the way people instinctively straightened when he entered a space, even if they didn't know why. At 57, he had flown everything from Blackhawks to aircraft that officially didn't exist, commanded squadrons in wars that were never admitted, and written reports buried under layers of classification. He came to Falcon Mesa for something simple, a routine inspection, the kind of dog and pony formality that kept politicians and funding offices happy. But as he paused near the back of the room, he heard the instructors laughing about a woman outside. The stories rolled: midlife crisis, wannabe pilot, some rich wife looking for blog material. The cadets around them laughed too, still green enough to believe every judgment that dripped from their seniors' tongues. Keane's expression didn't change. He listened, his jaw tightening. Then he left the room as quietly as he'd entered. The Arizona sun hit him like a hammer, but he didn't slow. He walked the gravel path back toward the tent. And there she was. Exactly where they'd said she'd be, sitting in the heat, as still and deliberate as a sniper on overwatch. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, but her posture carried no fatigue. She wasn't wilting, wasn't restless. She was waiting, in a way that only people who had lived on the edge of survival knew how to do. As Keane drew closer, she turned her head just enough to acknowledge him. That's when he saw it. A small tattoo just behind her left ear, partially hidden by her hairline. Ink faded with time, black turned to charcoal. At first glance, it looked ordinary, almost forgettable. But Keane's breath caught. 2 crossed rotors beneath a dagger. The mark of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. And below it, a symbol rarer still. A downward arrow crossed by a single line. Tier 1. Direct action. Keane stopped in his tracks. His pulse slowed, then quickened. He had seen that mark exactly 3 times in his career. Twice carved into citations he'd signed for men who never came home. Once in a briefing so secret it had vanished from existence. The instructors thought she was a civilian hobbyist. They couldn't have been more wrong. Air Marshal Robert Keane slowed his stride as he drew closer to the woman in the chair. The sun bore down, baking the gravel under his boots, but she sat like the heat didn't exist. He'd seen that kind of composure before, in soldiers who'd spent too many hours waiting for the right moment to move, in pilots about to make insertions no map believed possible. When he reached the edge of the tent's shadow, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes were green, sharp but unreadable, like looking at a horizon line through desert haze. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice pitched low so it wouldn't carry to the instructors laughing inside. She acknowledged him with a small nod. "Sir." Keane tilted his head, studying her profile. That tattoo behind her ear left no room for doubt. Most people wouldn't have recognized it. He wished he hadn't. "I couldn't help but notice your ink," he said, his tone even, conversational. "That's very specific." Her expression didn't change. No self-consciousness, no attempt to hide it. "It is. Mind if I ask where you earned it?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Her silence wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. She weighed him, read him in the same way experienced operatives did. His posture, the cut of his uniform, the weathering in his face. Finally, she said 2 words. Hindu Kush. Keen felt the air go thin. His throat tightened despite years of training himself never to show it. Afghanistan. The mountains where missions went in unacknowledged and came out in silence, if they came out at all. He knew what it meant for someone to carry that mark from that place. He leaned closer, voice almost a whisper. What's your call sign? Her eyes didn't waver. Ghost Actual. The name hit him like a physical blow. For a second, it was as though the desert heat itself vanished, replaced by memories he'd locked away. Briefings in shadowed rooms. Satellite photos of impossible valleys. Whispers of a mission called Red Sand, a flight no one thought survivable. Ghost Actual. The pilot who'd flown into terrain declared impassable by analysts and extracted a team against all odds. The story had circulated only in the narrowest channels, hushed tones, reverent disbelief. And then she had disappeared, as if she'd never existed. And here she was, sitting in a folding chair outside Falcon Mesa while his instructors mocked her like some curious tourist. Keen straightened slowly. His years of command had taught him how to hold composure, but even so, his pulse was hammering in his ears. The last time he'd heard that name, it was on lips trembling with awe and grief. He drew in a breath, his decision made. You'll fly today. She studied him for a moment, searching his face the way she might have studied a cockpit instrument panel in low light, methodically, without wasted motion. Then she gave the smallest nod. Inside the briefing room, the atmosphere shifted when Keen reappeared. The chatter died instantly. His expression alone carried the authority to silence an entire class of cadets. Which one of you turned away the woman outside? His voice wasn't raised, but it carried. Aviator Guy raised his hand reluctantly. That was me, sir. But she's not on the manifest, and we're running evaluations. Keen cut him off with a stare sharp enough to slice. Did you look at her paperwork? Yes, sir. But did you look at her? The instructor faltered. His mouth opened, closed. Let me be very clear, Keen said, his tone measured, each word dropping like a weight. The woman sitting outside has more hours in an Apache than everyone in this room combined. She has flown missions that never existed, in places you cannot pronounce, for reasons you will never be cleared to know. And she came here today with authorization that you dismissed because you assumed she was no one. The room was silent, cadets frozen, instructors pale. Even the air conditioning seemed to hush. Keen's gaze swept across them. She is not a civilian. She is Captain Elena Ramirez, retired. Night Stalkers. Tier 1. Call sign Ghost Actual. The name dropped like a stone in water, rippling through the room. A few cadets glanced at each other, their faces shifting from disbelief to dawning recognition. Someone at the back whispered the words, barely audible, Red Sand. Keen let the silence stretch. Now, here's what's going to happen. The simulator will be prepped. Full weapon systems, full electronic suite, no training wheels. And she will fly. Are we clear? A chorus of, yes, sir, followed, subdued and shaky. Keen's eyes cut back to the 2 instructors who had mocked her earlier. And the next time a night stalker asks to fly one of your birds, the correct response is, yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am. Understood? Yes, sir, they stammered in unison. He turned on his heel, his stride sharp and purposeful, leaving behind a room of cadets scrambling to pull up search results on their phones. Night Stalkers, Ghost Actual, Hindu Kush. The jokes had died in their throats. Nobody was laughing anymore. Back outside, Elena was exactly where he'd left her, seated in the metal chair, duffel still at her feet. But her posture had shifted. Not visibly, not to untrained eyes. It was subtle, her spine carrying a different weight, her stillness sharpening into readiness. Keen stopped in front of her. "Simulator's yours," he said simply. "Full capabilities unlocked." She rose, shoulders square, bag lifted with one smooth motion. "Thank you, Marshal." They walked side by side toward the hangar, their strides matching without effort. Keen felt a strange humbling in the act, as though sharing pace with someone who belonged more to the shadows of history than to the present moment. Someone whose reputation was never written down but lived in whispers, in the respect of those who knew what it took to survive. "May I ask you something, Captain?" Keen said. "Elena is fine." "Elena? Why here? Why now? You could have flown a sim at half a dozen bases with better equipment and less resistance." For a long while, she said nothing. Her boots scuffed the gravel in quiet rhythm with his. Finally, she spoke. "I made a promise to someone who can't keep it himself anymore." Keen didn't press. He didn't need to. In their line of work, promises to the dead were as binding as orders from the living. Ghosts accumulated over the years. Some you carried because you had to. Some because you couldn't let them go. He nodded once, the gesture carrying all the understanding words could not. The simulator hangar loomed ahead, its doors yawning wide. Cool air spilled out, a blessed relief against the oppressive desert heat. A small crowd had already gathered near the entrance, word traveled fast on military bases. And word about legends traveled faster still. Elena didn't acknowledge the whispers or the stares. She simply adjusted her bag, her face calm, her pace steady. Keen matched her step for step, the thought running through his mind like a drumbeat. The ghost had come back to fly. The hangar smelled faintly of oil and cool air spilling from overworked vents. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow across the Apache flight simulator, a hulking machine designed to mimic every detail of a combat helicopter's cockpit. Its matte black frame gleamed faintly, intimidating in its precision. A small crowd had already gathered near the entrance. Mechanics with grease still on their hands, cadets pretending they just happened to be nearby, instructors standing stiffly, trying not to show how badly their earlier arrogance now stung. Elena Ramirez walked past them without acknowledgement. No nerves, no theatrics. Just the quiet assurance of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Her duffel slid from her shoulder onto the floor as she approached the simulator, her gaze sweeping the cockpit like an old friend she hadn't seen in years. She ran her fingertips lightly along the metal edge, tracing switches, gauges, and monitors. Her movements weren't sentimental. They were checks, confirmations, a ritual born of countless pre-flight inspections. She wasn't remembering, she was verifying. Marshal Keen stood off to the side, arms folded, eyes never leaving her. The crowd watched him too, searching for cues in his expression, but he remained unreadable. Without ceremony, Elena climbed into the pilot's seat. Her hands moved across the controls with deliberate efficiency, flipping switches, adjusting settings, tightening straps, fitting the helmet. Every motion was muscle memory. She wasn't just entering a simulator. She was returning to a space she once commanded. The simulator screens came alive, flooding with terrain data. Mountains loomed across the projected horizon, valleys carved deep like scars. For a moment, everything in the hangar seemed to hold its breath. Keen felt it before he saw it. The mission profile wasn't random. Somehow, the system had defaulted, or perhaps been set, to that scenario. Red sand. The impossible insertion. The mission that had cemented Ghost Actual as a legend. And the one that had taken her co-pilot's life. Elena saw it too. Her hands hesitated over the controls. Just for a heartbeat, her composure cracked, an echo of memory flashing across her face. Then the mask returned. Her fingers resumed their dance across the switches, initializing the mission. Keen's jaw tightened. Damn it. Who queued that profile? But Elena didn't ask for it to be changed. She didn't look to anyone for reprieve. She simply flew. The simulated Apache lifted off with the steady grace of a predator that had never doubted its strength. The rotor wash hummed through the speakers, filling the hangar with the thumping heartbeat of the bird. Elena's hands made micro-adjustments on the cyclic, movements so subtle they were almost invisible, yet the helicopter responded as if tethered to her will. She pushed the craft low, hugging the terrain. Nap of the earth flying. The screens showed mountain ridges closing in, jagged rock faces that left margins measured in inches. The crowd collectively leaned forward, breaths shallow, as the simulated rotors missed stone by the width of a boot. To Elena, it was routine. Her posture didn't change. Breathing steady. Eyes sweeping instruments, terrain, sky. Every adjustment born of instinct honed by years in places where hesitation meant death. The mission threw everything at her, crosswinds funneled through valleys, sudden mechanical failures, communications jamming that turned the cockpit into a wall of static. On-screen tracers lit up from simulated enemy fire, streaking red across the horizon. Elena's response was calm, measured, surgical. A roll here. A dive there. Her maneuvers weren't flashy, they were precise. She didn't waste energy showing off. She flew to survive. The cadets watching began whispering to each other in disbelief. One muttered, "That landing zone isn't even possible." Another, shaking his head, "Terrain data says it's sealed off." Keen heard them, but his eyes stayed locked on her. He remembered the reports, the maps, the incredulity of analysts who swore no helicopter could reach the objective. He remembered the stunned silence after Ghost Actual proved them wrong. And now, he was watching it again. Elena guided the Apache into a slot between two cliffs, rock faces so tight the aircraft looked ready to shear itself apart. Inches of clearance, no more. The simulated rotors dipped, flexed, then cleared with impossible smoothness. The room went dead silent. Keen saw it in her face, just a flicker as the landscape mirrored her memory. The valley, the dust, the moment she'd once fought against gravity itself to bring her crew home. He knew she was seeing ghosts in the glass. But her hands never faltered. The helicopter touched down in the impossible landing zone. Smooth. Controlled. Final. And just like that, the mission ended. The screens faded to black. The thump of rotors died into silence. Elena removed her helmet. Her hair clung damply to her forehead, but her expression was unchanged, calm, steady. She climbed out with the same quiet precision she'd shown climbing in. For a long moment, nobody moved. The hangar was as still as the desert outside. Then someone started clapping. Slow, hesitant. Another joined. Then more. The sound built, swelling into applause that filled the space. But it wasn't performance applause, it was recognition. The kind reserved for mastery, for the realization that you had just witnessed something you might never see again. Elena didn't acknowledge it. She picked up her duffel, slung it over her shoulder, and headed for the exit. Keen intercepted her at the door. For a second, they stood face to face, two veterans who understood the weight of silence better than speeches. It was an honor, Keen said simply. Elena gave a small nod. Nothing more. Then she walked out into the furnace heat of Arizona. Behind her, the applause faded. The whispers would not. The crowd dispersed slowly. Cadets rushed to their phones, searching Ghost Actual with frantic urgency. Instructors exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier mockery now bitter on their tongues. The female mechanic, Sarah Chen, stood rooted, replaying every detail in her head. The way Elena's hands moved. The stillness she carried. The grace of someone who had already lived through more than simulations could ever replicate. Sarah had never seen flying like that. She doubted she ever would again. Outside, the desert sun was lowering toward the mountains, painting the tarmac in molten gold. Elena's silhouette walked steadily across the heat-rippled airfield, her pace unhurried, her figure dissolving into the distance like a mirage returning to the sand. Inside the hangar, they finally understood. She wasn't a tourist. She wasn't a hobbyist. She was Ghost Actual. And legends didn't need applause. Mechanics whispered among themselves, wide-eyed with awe.